We're all nearly wired here. I hope you are, for what I think will be an exciting evening. My name is Charles Royer. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our forum, where this evening we will review the 1980s, the decade of the 80s, a decade that Haynes Johnson, one of our guests this evening, who just wrote a book about the 80s, calls the most important decade, perhaps, since the 40s. Our principal means of travel, our time machine, will be Haynes Johnson's new book, Sleepwalking Through History, America in the Reagan Years. Our principal tour guides tonight are here with me, two Pulitzer Prize-winning writers and two political affairs experts from the Reagan White House. Our time en route is about an hour and a half, with about a third of that hopefully dedicated to your questions. Bill Lacey, on my right, is a fellow at the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School. He's a former director of the White House Office of Political Affairs, 1985 to 87, director of the Dole for President campaign in 1988. Lynn Nofziger, on my left, the first time he's been so characterized, is...
Got your recommendation.
Which has been said of him many times in similar situations, I'm sure. First met the protagonist in Haynes Johnson's book, Ronald Reagan, as his press secretary when he was a candidate for governor back in 1966. And after 20-plus years, a close Reagan advisor, director of political affairs in the White House, a Reagan campaign consultant. He also worked in the Nixon White House and on the Ford Dole campaign. Ellen Goodman, to my right, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist in more than 440 newspapers around the country. She is, as we all know, here an associate editor of the hometown paper, the Boston Globe. And, of course, Haynes Johnson, who has been at the Washington Post for more than 20 years. He, too, is a Pulitzer Prize winner, in fact, for his coverage of the civil rights struggle in Selma while he was at the Evening Star in Washington. We television agers probably know him best as a regular on PBS's Washington Week in Review. Haynes Johnson describes in the prologue the story he sets out to tell in this book this way: how the United States was transformed from world's leading creditor nation into world's leading debtor, how its new debts mortgaged the nation's future, how the 80s ended with the greatest promise internationally in half a century and with the greater challenge for America to win the peace after the Cold War, how the domestic and foreign policies of the 80s left America more vulnerable in the 90s to problems involving energy and hostage-taking and relationships with terrorist third world states, how the most conservative administration of the century ended America's age of reform, how the American people and their leaders and political institutions appeared to be sleepwalking through history, and how the nation traveled from the new patriotism to the new greed, all within a mere decade, form the central thread of this story. Let's begin with Haynes Johnson to set the stage further for our discussion, and then we'll turn to our other guests for their perceptions and reactions both to the book and to the decade. Haynes Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was in a small library in Maryland last night, and before I got up to talk, it's doing this book thing. You're endlessly talking about your book somewhere, and it's nice to do so. And they announced that the library was having to cut its services, and its hours, and its books, and its supplies. This was in the wealthiest suburb of Washington, D.C., not an inner-city place. And I was struck at that point. This may seem a strange way to take off, but everywhere I travel now, I see consequences of what we've just passed through. And they keep growing. The failure of a great insurance company in California this week was the largest insurance failure in the nation's history, followed after the banking system distress, following after the savings and loan debacle that we'll be paying for long into the next century. The fact that the reason the library in Potomac, Maryland, perhaps the wealthiest suburb, as you know so well, Len, being Washington.
Falls Church, one of the poorest suburbs.
But the reasons are not complicated. Every state and municipality across the country now finds itself in a deep budget crisis. The debts have mounted, and the social and economic dislocations that have come out of that period all have spawned a period where we're going to be playing off them and dealing with them for years to come. So I started this book and have attempted to look at the country to ask why it happened. What were the consequences of it? And it isn't just Ronald Reagan, who presided so wonderfully. He filled the television screens as no one has in our lifetime, made the country feel good, rekindled a sense of optimism that the country had lost after failure of leaders, destroyed and disgraced and driven from office, one after the other, left, right, black, white, all gone. And here comes Reagan, promising hope, success. And the country wanted to believe that. And they did. And they bought it. And he succeeded. That's the other thing. Reagan actually succeeded in doing what he said he was going to do. He cut the taxes. He increased defense spending. He privatized government services. He further deregulated the society. He fought communism covertly at any cost. And don't worry about the laws or the Constitution in the process. And he actually prevailed on all the things he set out to do. So you see, I think he was a consequential president, one that made a difference. I would argue that he made a difference that we're all going to be paying for, the excesses of the 80s. I don't mean that he created Michael Milken or Ivan Boesky or led to the crash on Wall Street or further divided the society as I believe it is today in its many parts. But I think he helped create a climate through which we're now passing. And maybe that's enough just to sort of set the stage for why I believe it's important.
Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much, Charlie. It's great to be here with such a distinguished panel and to get a chance to talk about the 80s. One thing that struck me very strongly as I read Haynes' book, which is very well written, is a very interesting book, is the tremendously negative tone of the book. People in my profession, political consulting, are criticized very heavily for negative attitudes towards politics. And yet the thing that struck me so incredibly strongly as I read the book was how everything in the 80s was bad, everything in the 80s was evil, everything in the 80s was wrong. And what I didn't really see at all in reading Haynes' book are any references to things that may have happened that were positive. And so I want to talk about a couple of those tonight. While not necessarily arguing that bad things didn't happen during the 80s, certainly they did, but there were good things as well. Number one, we're closer to worldwide peace towards maintaining it today than we ever have been since the Cold War began. That's largely because of two reasons. Number one, it's because Ronald Reagan's defense buildup, no matter what you think about it, or may agree or disagree with it, in fact has pressured the Soviets and Mikhail Gorbachev into accepting greater democracy in Eastern Europe and taking a more open-minded view towards democracy even in the Soviet Union. Second part of that, and this is something that is never really discussed or reviewed in any depth, is the fact that Ronald Reagan negotiated very significant nuclear arms limitation agreements with Mikhail Gorbachev. And because of those two developments, today the peace of the world is much, much closer, is much more stable, is much more solidified than it was as we went into the 80s. Secondly, I think that something very, very important that Haynes does talk about a little bit, certainly in his book. And in fact, from having the chance to talk to him tonight, I think it is really one of the important themes, but it's one that we'll disagree on, and that's really rethinking the federal government's role in our society. I think that the tax cuts, deregulation, shifting power and autonomy from the federal level to the local level are all very positive achievements. And I think that in effect what we've done is created an economic opportunity for all of our people. What we in effect did during the 80s is we increased median family income throughout the United States by over 7%, and we decreased the number of families making $15,000 or less to a level that's lower than it has been in any of the last three or the two previous censuses. That's an achievement in my mind, and more significantly is the fact that we've enjoyed the greatest sustained period of economic growth in the history of our country. So I think rethinking the government's role has been significant in terms of what happened during the 80s, and I think the changes that were made were significant and were generally positive. Third, very important in my mind, is the restoration of the American presidency. John F. Kennedy was only president for 3 years. We were deprived of his leadership. Lyndon Johnson had some accomplishments, yes, but his presidency ultimately failed under the burden of the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon's presidency failed because of Watergate. Gerald Ford only had 2 years and didn't succeed. And Jimmy Carter's presidency was an absolute disaster for our country. And the disaster was much, much bigger than simply the Iran hostage episode. Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981 against that backdrop, and he restored the presidency. So that even though you may disagree in many ways with what he accomplished, in fact, just the fact that he was able to come in and restore faith in the most important office, in the most powerful office in the free world is, in my mind, a very, very significant accomplishment. Very significant. Now, all those three combined seem to me, and there are others that we could talk about, but those are three very significant points. And they're not addressed to that degree in Haynes' book, especially the part about world peace. And it really astounded me. It was a very good book, Haynes. I enjoyed reading it. I disagreed with you a lot on it. And I'd have to say after reading the book that if I could give you a nickname, I'd call you Dr. Doom, because the book was full of gloom and doom. And I think the 80s, in fact, had some very positive contributions to our country and to our society.
Lynn Nostiger, do you agree with that assessment of the 80s?
Well, I find it easier to agree with Bill than I do with Haynes. And I just want to say one thing, and that is I'm waiting for the book to come out in paperback. And then I will read it, and I hope you get your royalties off the paperbacks, too. I find something interesting going on in Washington, in my view, and that is there seems to be a two-pronged effort in Washington. One is to rehabilitate Jimmy Carter. I think I'll refrain from saying anything further. The other is to, at the same time, downgrade the Reagan years, make the Reagan years indeed look like that they were not successful years, and at the same time, interestingly, put all the blame for everything that has gone wrong in the world in the last couple of years, as well as what went wrong in the previous 8 years, on Ronald Reagan's shoulders. It's almost as if we didn't have a Congress. It's almost as if we didn't have a Congress that authorizes and appropriates money. So we have put all the blame for the deficit on Ronald Reagan. It's almost as if people had forgotten that deregulation began in the Carter years, not in the Reagan years. It's almost literally as if we had forgotten that we were indeed in the middle of a Cold War that had not really gotten any better over the years, whether it was Nixon's détente or what it was, and it was and it's as if all that Ronald Reagan had done was negative. And Haynes and I were on another program a few days ago, and I find it very difficult to argue with him because he says nice things about Ronald Reagan, and that throws me clear off. But nevertheless, the point that I made then and I would like to make here is that if you are going to blame Reagan for all of the things that went wrong in the 80s and up through and including today, then you're going to have to give them credit for everything that went right in the 80s. And as Bill pointed out, much went right. Certainly we got a new spirit of optimism across the land, something that we hadn't seen in years and years and years, really, since the early days of Jack Kennedy. We had a kind of a can-do feeling in this country, and it is still there to some extent. And yes, you can point out the things that have gone wrong, but let's not forget the things that went right. Much went right in the United States during the 1980s. I think the decade of the 80s was probably as positive a decade overall as we've gone through in this century.
Lynn, could I ask you just to interject before we turn to Ellen, the notion of there being a new spirit of optimism. The Harris poll not long ago said that the decade ending the 80s, in 1989-90, people reacted in a way that was much more negative toward the government in the 80s than they did in the 60s. In the 60s,
I think that's a
well, let me
positive
just finish.
effect.
Let me finish the question. The 1960s, you know, more than half of the people, when asked, said they trusted the government more often than not to do the right thing. The 1980s, the same question, the same poll, less than half of the people believed that. And the 60s were a tough time, which leads me to believe that the 80s, if that attitude in the country is correctly perceived, if that's what it is, then the 80s were real tough on optimism of America.
Oh, I don't think so. I think Americans looked and said, we can do it. We don't have to turn to government. I don't think a mistrust of government is a lack of optimism or is pessimism per se. I think there are, that many people in the 80s said, hey, there are opportunities here that have nothing to do with government, and we don't trust government, and we ought to get government out of the way.
Well, to me it seems that government is sort of us in that well, we might be saying something about ourselves with that statement. But that's my own view. Ellen, your view on the 1980s.
Well, my view on the 1980s reminds me a little bit of the wonderful line from The Third Man where Orson Welles is asked what he thinks of the 20th century. And he says, the 20th century, I could draw a better century out of a hat. So in brief, that's my view of the 80s. But one of the things that fascinated me and interests me now, because here we are in the 90s obsessing about the 80s, and I agree with Haynes that we're going to be obsessing about the 80s for a long time. But during the 80s, in fact, we obsessed about the 60s. And many of the arguments that we thought we had settled in the 60s cropped up again. And I'm the token sociologist in this group. And we certainly talked about abortion in Vietnam, about creation and evolution, these arguments about whether teenagers in one state could read the Lorax. I mean, these issues cropped up again during the 80s in ways that are fairly stunning. Sociologically. I tend to remember most how the 80s ended, which was, if you recall, in December of 1989, we discovered that Ronald Reagan had water on his brain. That was the last footnote to the 80s. That was also my cynical footnote. I think also that during the 80s, one of the things that happened was that the essential tension in American society got out of whack. In other words, Americans, ever since de Tocqueville was here, have had a fundamental tension between individualism and community, between that pick yourself up by your bootstraps part of the American character, and on the other hand, the sense that life had no meaning unless it was lived in the context of others. And with others. And I think that during the 80s, that very much got out of whack. There was a kind of privatization of problems that Lynn described it as the positive side of not having any faith in government was that you suddenly had faith in yourself. I would say that the notion that you couldn't look to others for help became focused on the notion that you had to look to yourself that in fact you were all you had. And there's some sort of quirky evidence for that. I mean, certainly we went through in the 80s a massive period when we had emphasis on 12-step programs. Far more people joined 12-step programs than joined political caucuses. And even church basements were generally taken over by these programs, and there was even something called the codependency problem, which is a problem that stated, in essence, that people who needed people who needed help, people who needed people needed help, a kind of curious concept in that. And I think that is very, and probably the largest sort of the moral problems were all cast as problems of individualism or as individuals as well. The largest moral question that faced many urban Americans on a daily basis was whether they, as individual people, should give alms to other individuals, the urban street beggars who came upon them. And I think in many ways that sense of community broke down. And that pick yourself up by your bootstraps side of individualism took over, and the country is still suffering from the sense that there is nothing larger than the single cell of self. And we are now, I think, trying to reach out and balance that in ways, but it's extremely tricky, and that's another more sociological legacy of the 80s.
Haynes, we'll give you another shot before we...
I'd like to say, Bill tagged me as being Dr. Doom or whatever, gloom, and I'm really not terribly gloomy. I agree that the hope for Reagan, and I think it's a tragedy, was exactly what you described, that the country had gone through a process of perceived failure, seen all of its leaders destroyed across the board, and I think that helps us put Reagan on the stage. And Reagan came in, it was like, and he didn't make us be what we are, but he helped create a climate, and there are consequences for policies and actions. The reason California has historic debts today, where you started out when we first met each other years ago, was in California. They were the golden calf at that point. Best in everything in public services facilities today, go to California now, and they're broke.
They only got a $13 billion deficit.
Right, that's right. And there are reasons for that, is what I'm suggesting. I'd like to say one other thing that Bill made a point, and this is something that I think we're going to have to deal with from years to come as you look back on Reagan's place. And that is that, yes, he ended the Cold War and he put the stake through the heart of communism. And that he alone did it, and without that defense buildup, we wouldn't have had the collapse of communism, the wall wouldn't have come down, and freedom wouldn't have flourished across the globe, and Tiananmen Square and leaping through the ether electronically. And it was Reagan that did that. It may have been terrible here at home, but look what he produced. Well, the idea that the defense buildup the 80s alone caused the collapse of communism, I think, is a fallacy. Every president since Harry Truman committed American, and every Congress and every taxpayer committed American treasure and commitment and defenses to fighting a Cold War. We did it for almost half a century. We lost people in Vietnam. I served 3 years in Korea myself. People died. This country made commitment after. So it wasn't just one president that did it. The missile systems that were founded didn't just happen in the Reagan era. The Patriot was up here. I guess Tip O'Neill deserves that one probably. If I looked into it, I suspect I'd find that. And Eisenhower and the rest. So there was a cumulative process there. And Reagan certainly played a part in that role. I don't appreciate that at all. But the new myth is going to be, you see, that's what he left us, the Cold War ending. Thank God it's over, but I don't think the world is necessarily a more stable place now. And we're now facing different kinds of problems. And the only point to talk about the 80s is what are we going to learn from them? What lessons do we draw politically, socially, economically, and as a country? And that's why I was so happy to be here. I mean, and to hear what these people have to say.
We're going to move to the questioning now. Please, if you'd like to ask a question, go to the microphones or make a comment. Let's try not to Let's let most of the speech making be from this august spot. But let's identify yourselves and try to get as many people in as possible. And please direct your question at one of the panelists. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm Steve Raven, and I'm visiting from across the river from the School of Public Health. And when we look at the 80s, we look at the AIDS epidemic as something that sort of got away from the nation, particularly the administration. Mr. Lacey pointed to decentralizing things to the states as a great victory, but we look at that as actually one of the contributing factors, no federal leadership handing things over to the states. I guess Mr. Novsinger, being part of the team that brought that administration in,
Guilty.
Where do we go from here
Where do we go from here?
on the AIDS epidemic?
That's a question that's, I think, almost unanswerable. To some people, the AIDS epidemic is the major problem that the United States faces, when the United States, in fact, faces many major problems. So you just can't take and isolate the AIDS epidemic out and say we're going to focus all our energies and all our wealth and everything else on doing that. We've had a thing called a cancer epidemic. I remember when Richard Nixon declared war on cancer, and we're still doing that. We're still trying to find an answer to that. So where do we go in the AIDS epidemic? I presume that we continue to do what we have been doing, which is researching and trying to find answers. But if you want to go spend $50 billion on it, it isn't going to do probably that much more good than what you're spending now, in my opinion.
Yes, sir.
My name is Ron Langston. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I'm from the state of Iowa. I'm also a Republican.
Welcome aboard.
Lynn, my question is directed towards you, but anyone can answer it. I also was an appointee in the Reagan administration, and I was very concerned about the Republican image during my stay in the Reagan administration. I didn't particularly like some of the Reagan Republicans that I worked with, and particularly the California Republicans that I worked with.
Getting very close to home
I
here.
live in Virginia now.
I thought they represented the institutional dark side of the Republican Party. And my question to you, I'm very concerned about the future image of the Republican Party, particularly in how it relates to people on the domestic policy front. And I feel that the party has been captured by I don't want to say right wing, because that's too trite, but a wing of the Republican Party that has become very insensitive and callous. And they have institutionalized a dark side of the party that I'd like to see vanish. And I'd like to see whether you concur in that, and if so, what are your views as to how we can reach out and be more sensitive to those that we supposedly care about?
Well, first of all, I don't think that the Republican Party has been captured in recent years. I have to tell you, I think that the Republican Party for years and years and years has been insensitive to a lot of the things that you're alluding to. And some people have worked to make it less so, and some have not. I recall once again that in the Nixon era there was an effort made to bring blacks into the party and to make them a viable part of society and of the economy, much more so than before, and much more so than after the Nixon years. So I don't think, though, that there has been that kind of a change in the Republican Party in the last 8 or 10 years. I don't know what the answer is. The answer is to have I do too. I know what my answer is, to have an ongoing effort to bring people into the party, as Lee Atwater talked about. But that just doesn't mean anybody regardless of their philosophy of government, but it means anybody regardless of their color or their economic status or that sort of thing. And what has happened over the years is Republicans have worked at that 6 months out of every 4 years. And what they've got to do is work at it 4 years out of every 4 years.
Well, I'll follow up real quick and sit down. The Republican Party that I grew very fond of and joined through Bob Ray and Mary Louise Smith, state of Iowa, did not condone the kind of mentality that produces a Willie Horton type of a show. And I think that's where we have drifted to, and I hope that we drift away from that. Thank you.
Did we just jump in where we want to?
Brad?
My name is Brad Minnick. I'm an alumnus of the school. My question is for Haynes. You're very critical in your book of the effect of the policies of the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan was more popular when he left office than when he came in. He was the first president to serve 2 successful terms since Eisenhower, and the first president to see his vice president directly elected since the 1800s. My question is, what does that say about American politics today, and what advice would you have for the Democratic Party, given that 1992 is around the corner, in terms of recapturing the White House? Is it possible?
Well, you said a Democratic Party. Is there such a thing? I'm not sure. The record you cited is certainly correct, and I agree with what Bill Lacey said earlier. Reagan certainly did restore the power of the office of the presidency, no question about that. He left office more popular than when he came in. That's true. George Bush became the first president since vice president to be elected since Martin Van Buren. That's true. But I don't think that's necessarily what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the kind of response we had just a minute ago when the gentleman asked about AIDS. Very specific question. And I think the difference is the Democrats are only going to win when they can respond properly to that kind of question. It isn't that you're going to solve the problem overnight, but you're going to set a standard to say the country will begin dealing with it, to try to find a solution positively. Doesn't mean you're going to promise the millennium and say that money alone can do it. Ronald Reagan, for instance, Len, there was a wonderful, sort of, I thought, sad story. After he left office, the general who was his doctor gave an interview, and he said, you know, Reagan said to me he never heard about AIDS until the actor got AIDS. And, you know, he's talking about Rock Hudson. And then he had this long conversation. Gee, is it that bad? Really? It is, you know. And I'm serious here. I'm not just, but I think that's the difference. It requires a kind of leadership that says, we are going to do with these problems, education or infrastructure or research and development or health and welfare, and set goals and do it. And whoever that person is going to inherit the future.
Can you, Bill, and maybe Haynes and maybe Lynn as well, or Ellen,
That takes all 4.
That takes all 4 of you. Respond to the point that Bill Lacey made earlier on that goes partly to Brad's question. The debate seems to be, did Reagan do okay or did he not? Bill said that President Reagan rethought the role of government, and therefore part of his success was in rethinking the role of government. I served in the decade, throughout the decade, as the mayor of a major American city. My sense was that there was no rethinking during that period from the federal government about the intergovernmental system and how it worked. There was an attempt, the New Federalism, there was an attempt to discuss how that the governments related, but there was no thinking through of significant change. As I think in many areas, there was no thinking through of significant change in the way the federal government behaves or the way it reacts. Can you give me some sense of how it was that, and in which areas that the role of the federal government was rethought and how that actually advanced the way the government does business today?
Well, that's a very good question, and as I sit up here listening to some of these policy questions, I think it would be nice to have, aside from me, and I'm just basically a political hack, but who had the chance to serve Ronald Reagan and learn a lot about his administration, some Republican policy people up here to talk about policies like that. But of course, I think that's a good question. It's a fair point, but my point is that Ronald Reagan essentially said this, that too many decisions are being made by the federal government, more need to be made locally. And one of the things that we need to try to do in our country is we need to try to return some of that autonomy to the states, to the cities, to start making some of those decisions closer to home, because I'm sure, as you would agree, Charlie, you're better able to make decisions as mayor of Seattle than the federal government is. What I'm saying, that was a goal and that was an objective, and we got people to talk about it, and maybe we really didn't accomplish as much as we would have liked to in that area in terms of very specific ideas. But Ronald Reagan was successful in the sense of getting people to at least consider that thought, consider turning what had been the trend towards larger federal government and greater federal involvement since the New Deal back. And I think he was successful in doing that.
In your book, Haynes, you get to this point, if I remember it correctly, that there are different kinds of conservatives in history. There are conservatives who thought through the way the government actually worked, and then there are those who are perhaps more gut-level conservatives who reacted almost instinctually and made decisions in that fashion rather than in a more thoughtful fashion. Is that a fair characterization of the way you described it?
I always thought Reagan was, we seem to be focusing on Reagan rather than the era here a little bit, but I thought that Reagan was fascinating in that he came to office as this New Dealer. You remember when you first met him, probably, he was a great exponent of Franklin Roosevelt. But I've always thought, and secretly, he was really reinvented of Calvin Coolidge.
Oh, his
As a matter of fact,
by the way.
yeah, as a matter of fact, that was his hero. Someone once asked me, the presidents can't do very much, but they can sort of set the symbol. They get to pick the portrait that they admire of the president and put it on the wall of the White House. And they can cast the other ones aside. And by God, when Reagan came in that very first day, January 20th, 1981, down went Harry Truman and down went Thomas Jefferson and so forth. And out came, out of the Smithsonian attic, dusted off and hung in honor, Calvin Coolidge. Let her rip, laissez-faire, don't worry about it, boom. And that's what we got.
Mukhlis. No, I'm sorry, we were over here.
I'm surprised that none of you have mentioned the phenomenal revival of religion in the United States in the 1980s. People may have lost faith in government, and government may be bankrupt, but as I understand it, religion is thriving, and people have more. I read a poll recently. People have unbelievable faith in religion. I wondered if perhaps during the 80s, the vast majority of Americans were trying to return to more traditional, stable, sustainable behavior and recover from the revolution of the 1960s. And the people that you're talking about may constitute only a few % of people whose uncontrolled greed exploited the opportunity of this recovery period like battlefield scavengers. And it occurs to me, maybe the Kennedy School of Government needs an Institute of Religion. I mean, if there's any...
They have liaisons with the Divinity School.
Well, they don't deal with the political aspects.
Ellen, do you want to take that question?
I think there's another grid to put over that, which is the aging population. That one of the things that we tend to forget also in terms of dealing with politics or dealing with a decade is that this vast group of Americans, the baby boom generation, were aging. And one of the things they did as they aged was to have children. And lo and behold, having children became a trend. And one of the things they did after they brought their twins, they went back to church, just like their parents did. I am not sure whether it was so much a revival of faith as it was a recognition that the family was so isolated in society that it needed to rejoin communities, and one of the most available communities in American society is the religious community. I think that there was much that has gone on was in fact generational. I wanted to take one, in line with that, the reforming of families and the baby boom generation getting older. Bill also mentioned that during the 80s the average family income increased 7%. And that's not very much when you consider that the average family doubled the number of workers it had. Because one of the enormous trends during the 80s was that working families who were, in fact, losing ground by staying still sent their wives, or their wives went back to work, let's put this positively. And we're just now recognizing that we're now, once again, where two workers are maintaining the lifestyle barely that one worker did previously, and there is no third worker to send back in. So I just wanted to take, unless we all start sending our children to work very early, but I wanted to take issue with that too.
That's a fair point, but I would also add that during the 70s, And by sort of definition, we're talking about the 80s as compared to other decades. During the 70s, median family income went down 5%. So whether it's additional people going to work or whatever, families are in fact financially better off than they were.
Well, how does that square bill with what another chronicler of the 80s, and in this case a Republican one, Kevin Phillips in The Politics of Rich and Poor, suggests? He says, and in fact, to quote another guy who came along after Kevin's book, Robert Reich from this institution, suggests in his new book that there has never been a gap between rich and poor so great as it exists today, with 20% of the top 20% of income earners in the country take home more than the bottom 80% combined. That there hasn't been a gap like this for 40 years. And Kevin Phillips is on television all the time saying, who invented the Republican majority, saying that the gap between rich and poor is greater than it has been in modern times. How does that square with what you're suggesting over the decade?
Well, there's a lot of people who'd probably, and I heard Lynn Chuckle take issue with whether or not Kevin Phillips is still a Republican or not. And I think it's interesting to point out that when Kevin Phillips wrote The Emerging Republican Majority in 1969, it was totally panned by the critics and all the academics. And to this very day, the Kennedy School of Government does not have that book in its library downstairs, incidentally. But now that he's come out with a book criticizing Ronald Reagan and criticizing the 80s, it's being quoted by you and others around Harvard as being this great tome of,
is it in the library now?
Thinking. What, the...
His book? Yeah.
Emerging Republican Majority?
No, I mean Rich and Poor.
It's not only, I don't know if it's in the library down here, but it's on sale in the bookstore, and it's actually required reading for quite a few of the courses.
But Bill, that doesn't address the question.
Right, the point is, though, that...
You're all evading the issue of religion. I still haven't heard it referred to.
No, we're getting there. We're just going at it in a kind of circuitous
consciously
way.
evading it.
We're going to end up there.
You haven't got a prayer.
Right. This is the Kennedy School, someone said. The point is, the statistics I gave you are correct. They're from Alan Reynolds, who's an economist for the Hudson Institute out in Indianapolis. And the fact of the matter is, there may be a broader gap between the top richest and the poorest. But the fact of the matter is, and the point that Kevin Phillips really ignored, I think, in his book, is the fact that the middle class is so much bigger and there are so many more people. And that ultimately gets to the question that someone else asked a few minutes ago, I think it was Brad Minnick, about the Democratic Party. The problem with the Democratic Party is they've lost track of how large the middle class have gotten. And they have totally had no ability at the presidential level, okay, as distinguished from senatorial and gubernatorial, but at the presidential level, they've had no ability to reach out to those people in the middle class because they don't feel that the Democrats at the national level represent them anymore.
Could I answer could talk about the religion a minute? I think you're right. I think that the people instinctively, in at least my reporting all over the country through the 80s, one of the reasons that people look to Reagan as the model is that there was a hunger in the country, not only for success and strength and all the rest, but for a new rebirth, to believe that we were strong ethically and morally and all the rest. And I don't appreciate that at all. I think that was very important. And I'm afraid, like so many other things, the actual letdown of it turns out to be what we got in the 80s. We got new religion, but we also got Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, and we got rattling those electronic tambourines and saving souls for a buck. And that was the 20s revisited for sure. And we got Ronald Reagan's family, which is not the portrait that the country thought. And I'm serious about that, and I think that's part of the problem. So it may well be that the end of it all is a further sense of, if not disillusionment, maybe it wasn't all, the act wasn't all it was purported to be.
Mukhlis.
Hello, my name is Mukhlis Balbalay. I'm a junior in the college, which makes me in a significant minority in this audience. I'm also from Chicago, Illinois, specifically DuPage County, a Republican stronghold of this county. And as someone who just finished his 20th birthday, I think I can provide a different perspective on these 80s because I grew up in them, and they were a formative part of my life. The impression I'm getting from the panel is that the 80s were this era of decadence and despair. Ms. Goodman, you mentioned that they were an era where individualism reigned. why is that a bad thing for individualism to get better?
Why is it?
The students that I know of my age are students that have gone on to make organizations like Teach for America, City Year for a Day, organizations that didn't get formed in the late 70s.
They got formed in the 90s.
Well, they were formed by people who grew up in the 80s, who grew up in this time of troubles. Perhaps that is because President Reagan was able to provide an image for young people to look up to, an image of success, an image, albeit, granted, a fake image in your eyes, but an image. Perception does make reality. I mean, John F. Kennedy is the god of perception, and being at the JFK School of Government, we should all realize that. The perception became reality, and people of my age looked up to someone who provided that sense of excellence, strived for it, and became people who expected to succeed. Hopefully we will, but at least we have that idea of success in our minds. In that sense, for the coming future of America, the 80s may not have been so bad, because they were able to create a generation which, like the generation of the 20s, went on to solve the problems of the 30s, like the generation of the 50s went on to do the things of the 60s. So from our perspective, maybe this wasn't really as bad as you say it was.
Well, I think you raise about 3 interesting points, the first of them being what's so bad about individualism. Nothing so bad about individualism. It is one of the great strains of American society. It's when it isn't balanced with community that we get into trouble. The other one is, and I think this is true of the generation now in their 20s, that both those who thought Ronald Reagan was terrific and those who thought he was terrible, in a sense, learned the same thing, which was to not look to government, but to look to create either in themselves or in volunteer organisms, or to also to get involved in what I would regard as risk-free behavior, in the following sense that over the last many years, many undergraduates at this college have been involved through Phillips House and so forth in one-on-one volunteer activities. And it's been terrific. And they have also produced Teaching for America. I mean, your generation has also produced that. And all of that has been terrific, but it's been apolitical, if not anti-political. It's been the notion that you wouldn't get fooled by getting involved in something political that would turn sour on you or go south on you. And it's been involved in the notion that you can best serve one-on-one and not through union, not through organization. And that is a way to do good, but not a way, in my view, for social change. So it's had a specific kind of value, but it's also had it's left a particular kind of emptiness. And one must remember that your generation, I'm not putting the weight of your generation on your shoulders, but your generation doesn't vote. And that comes out of a particular kind of alienation. And that alienation also grew during the 80s.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to turn back to the time machine to 1980, and let's get a little perspective on what really happened that doesn't seem to be coming out here. If you were any place else in the world other than the United States in 1980, where would you have liked to have been? And where did you end up if you had the chance? And we literally had millions of people who gave their lives trying to get to the United States. And I know people here in the Boston area, and I'm sure everybody else does, people that whenever they got here, they were probably less than 5 feet tall, weighed less than 100 pounds, couldn't speak English, and had nothing in their pocket. And today, 10 years later, they have a restaurant or they have a business, they have a computer company, and they've become very successful, and they've asked nothing from our government in any large measure. And it seems to me that we had some wonderful opportunities in the 80s, and I'd like to hear some of your perspectives on that.
That's true. I'll drink for that.
We've had opportunities for 200 years, and it's worked.
I didn't get any feeling of that from any of you
on this panel,
though.
My only point is that we ought to be more true to our own traditions, and I think that's what we weren't doing. I think we've created problems for ourselves needlessly. That's my point about the period. And we're now dealing with them, and the opportunities are in fact, I think, more diminished now. We are not in as strong a competitive position in the world today as we were. We're going to be playing off that, and we have problems there. And I think to suggest that everything's well is not the right question. We ought to suggest to ourselves, how can we fix it? That's what it ought to be.
I don't think anybody's suggesting everything is well. I would like to point out that a lot of the things that came along in the 80s, good and bad, have their antecedents much before the 80s. Absolutely. I mean, so to isolate a 10-year period out and say all these things kind of sprang full blown in the 80s, to me doesn't make sense. I would like to say, just as long as I got the floor here, one thing to you, Ellen. I think a return to individualism is indeed social change. It may not be the social change you want, but moving from dependence on government to dependence on self, I think, is major social change.
Ken, as long as we're talking about 1980, one kind of current concern about that specific period of time that's in the news today that is not dealt with in Haynes Johnson's book is the allegation that during the campaign in 1980 that the Reagan campaign attempted to forestall the release of the hostages in order to prevent President Carter from getting a boost in October and therefore winning the election. The allegations are out. There was a Frontline documentary on it last night on television. You wrote about that. You wrote about the Iran-Contra affair. You wrote about that period in the campaign. I wonder if you'd address those recent allegations, and then maybe Lynn, because you were involved, you could also speak to it.
To try to do it very quickly, it's an utterly fascinating story, and I don't think we'll ever know for sure. It is not new, the allegations that there was a secret deal between the Reagan political operatives in 1980, specifically William Casey, later to head the CIA, who was the Reagan campaign chief. And it was known that there were meetings in Paris between Reagan political operatives and Iranians. And out of that came the suspicion that a deal had been struck. Now, Gary Sick, who was on the National Security Council for Jimmy Carter, in fact, dealing with the hostages right up until literally the day of the inauguration, on the phone, even as they went to the Capitol, in the phone, dealing with them. A scholar at Columbia University has spent the last several years, and he was a disbeliever in this conspiracy theory, by the way, looking back into the available records, re-interviewing hundreds of people, and has come up with new information that he says suggests strongly, and he now believes, that there was a deal struck. I don't know the truth of that. I didn't allude to it in the book because I couldn't prove it, and there's no point to deal with that if you can. And but it is. Two things are true, and I did say this. The Reagan people, I don't know if you felt this way or not, but I know Mike Deaver's on record as saying so, repeatedly believed that if the hostages came out before the election, that Carter would have still beaten Reagan. Fact. Okay? At least Deaver says so, and they talked about it openly, and therefore, and they were worried about they also knew that there was a second rescue operation mounted, that's a fact too, and that became operational for September. That's a fact. It never happened because the Iranians dispersed in September all the American hostages throughout Iran, so one operation couldn't get them. And there we are. There's the puzzle. We don't know.
Kind of reminds me of the books on the Kennedy assassination. Who shot Jack Kennedy? Actually, during a campaign today is really divided into two major parts. The people on the airplane and the people back at the headquarters. Bill Casey was back at the headquarters. I was on the airplane.
It's a good place to be.
Good place to be. There was a lot of talk on the airplane and in the campaign about what would happen if indeed they turned the hostages loose, especially in late October, early November. The candidate Reagan talked about it publicly, talked about an October surprise. That was the October surprise that we were worried about, because the only thing Reagan could have ever said under those circumstances is hooray and clapped his hands. And was no doubt in our minds that would have made a serious difference. As you look finally at the end result of that election, it might not have lost it for us, but on the other hand, it might have. But there was never any talk on that airplane about making any kind of a deal, and I'll tell you why. I don't think it's so much a matter of honesty and integrity. It's a matter of the risk not being worth it. If Carter had the CIA, the FBI, the State Department, and if there had been any hint of that they could have latched onto and made an issue out of before the election, it would have tended to destroy us almost as much as turning the hostages loose. So just as a matter of smart politics, it seems to me, because I've never been sure just how smart a politician Bill Casey was, but as a matter of smart politics, it seems to me that that's the last thing that you would want to get caught trying to do.
I should say, I neglect to say one important part about the new conspiracy theory. Sick says that there was a quid pro quo. The Iranians agreed to hold the hostages off until the election was over in the belief that Reagan was going to win, and then a deal was struck secretly that they would then get arms and money from the United States, and that the first arms to Iran actually was in 1981, not later in 1986.
Do we know that?
No, I'm just saying that's what he...
Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Edgar Powell, and I'm an alumni of the school. Although the 80s were recognized as a decade of prosperity, it seems to me that the real story was the growing disparity between the rich and the poor, between black and white, between inner city and suburb. That, along with the drug problem, I thought were the major social issues, and now, of course, the AIDS problem is a major health issue as well as social. I had the unique experience of standing here and having my whole question preempted by discussion to a previous question. I did note that the comment made about at the end of the 80s that there were more families with an average family income of over $15,000 per year, I think is more a function of inflation than it would be of social policy. My question to Haynes Johnson is, not having read your book, did you note in your studies and in your thoughts of the 80s that this was, in your mind, the major economic issue or a major economic issue, that of disparity, of growing disparity between rich and poor?
Yes, I wrote quite a lot about that, and I still feel that way very strongly now. I think one of the tragedies of the times is that we grew farther apart in this country and are so today, and it's economically, socially too, both. And I do think that, and I do spend a good bit of time talking about that, yes.
Young and old, the biggest disparities.
Young and old. Thank you, sir. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jim Saylor. I'm a research associate at the Business School. I'd sort of like to follow up on that and hear Ms. Goodman's perspective on, I just spent 4 years as a college student in Philadelphia, and it's quite apparent, if you spend any time at all in Philadelphia, that there is a very serious problem in America's inner cities, and is I'd like you to perhaps give your thoughts on the problem of the widening gap between the rich and the poor. And I think you've written about walking through Philadelphia homeless, being confronted by homeless people. But I'd like perhaps for you to discuss the problem of economic disparity as seen through the lens of the inner cities in America, knowing that while Philadelphia is in certainly very bad straits, and Frank Rizzo is trying to come to the rescue, but that maybe Boston is really not far behind, as well as the rest of the major eastern cities.
Urban are in the worst of the worst shape, and that we have let it happen. Clearly, I've walked through Philadelphia, I've walked through Boston, I've walked through D.C., I've walked through New York, and the problems are breathtakingly obvious.
To be partly fair, though, wouldn't you say, Ellen, that the case in Philadelphia is partly Philadelphia's problem, and the problem of the people of the state of Pennsylvania who've not given Philadelphia, the state at least, has not given Philadelphia many of the tools it needs to do what some other major American cities are able to do.
And it's
their
also
taxation, their revenue capacity, there are a lot of problems there that could be fixed, that might not fix the problems in Philadelphia, but that would go some way toward doing it, but it could be fixed by the state of Pennsylvania and the voters of the city of Philadelphia.
And it's also what Bill was saying earlier about the part of turning back attention to the new federalization and turning back, saying that the states and local governments should solve their own problems. It's one thing to turn those problems back, and it's quite another thing to turn them back without any money. So.
If Philadelphia had all the taxing power that it could possibly create, it still could not begin to deal with some of the deep structural problems that exist in Philadelphia and other major American cities.
Nobody's given me any answers here. All I hear is, and I presume you're all going to give me one answer, which is more federal money.
No, I don't think anyone said that yet. Maybe toward the
Well,
end.
I've
Or
been
maybe
waiting for you.
maybe it'll end up with religion. I don't know where we're going on this stuff.
But what I said before, I think it's not just the money or the program, it's the commitment. That's what's been lacking. And that's what it either works or it doesn't work. You either set goals and go for it, or you don't do it.
It's the original comment of the president during inauguration. We have more will than wallet. Well, it's not true, because the wallet follows the will.
LBJ gave us commitment to the war on poverty and ended up with more poor people than he had when he began it.
Well,
it's probably a function of the fact that there was 2 wars going on, and I won't comment who gave us that war. But my name is Louis Lisa, and I believe it started in '54. My name is Louis Lisa, and I'm an alumni of the school, and I guess I have a statement and a question. The Philadelphia issue always strikes me as being interesting because in '75, New York City was close to that same issue, and the federal government was able and willing to step in and help them out. I think we're looking at a problem now where the federal government is basically unable to help themselves out, and so I need Mr. Nafziger and some others to explain a little bit to me about where we as a nation are going and where we stand economically and financially. But before I leave that question with you, I'd just like to say that the feel-good era or euphoria of an administration that basically has given us more homeless people, more people without jobs, more a decline in education, a nation that, despite the feel-good euphoria, people can't say they feel safer now with a law enforcement president, that the problems are not just that of the urban or inner cities, but the problems are throughout this nation, that in the small suburban and rural communities, people are not feeling good. And so this euphoria you talk about, I don't believe is being shared by the farmers in the farm belts. I don't think it's being shared by the workers, domestic workers throughout the urban areas. And I don't necessarily see it being shared by students who are throughout this nation, not just in the Northeast, but in the South and in parts of the Midwest, who are not being able to receive funds to go into higher education. And I don't see this euphoria being shared. I mean, you may be listening to a drummer, but that's not the drummer I see in my travels throughout the nation. And I think the sadness is, as you did say correctly, that there was a failure on the part of the Democratic Party to be leaders, to be strong. They, in a sense, fell into whatever the media or theatrics of a president who had basically the wind blowing in his direction. I think we have to take some responsibility for that. But I'd like for you to tell me where we as a nation with a debt of over $2 trillion, whereas we as a nation with homeless and AIDS and rapid poverty taking over our economy with the banking crisis, where are we going with this feel-good mentality?
Well, I can see you belong with Mr. Johnson and some of these others who look everywhere and see gloom and doom. I don't. I know that the farmers in this country are pretty generally well off. No, it's true. It's true. I know that the American people, you up until this recent recession, we had unemployment at about 5%. This country is always going to have its peaks and valleys as far as the economy goes, just as other countries go. Where do we go? If I knew that, I'd go run for president.
We'll take. I think we need to take these two and this. If there's one more person who desperately needs to ask a question, let's do that now. But otherwise, I think we'll just deal with these three and then call it an evening. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Taya Grays, and I'm a freshman at the college. And before I ask my question, I'd like to comment on something that was stated by another member of the college. He had said that there were a lot of people within our generation who felt good about Reagan and were invigorated by what he did. But I'd like to note that there were just as many people that were dissatisfied by what Reagan did. And more sadly, there were probably people who weren't even aware what Reagan did within our generation, or even aware where the Soviet Union was, where we were supposed to be combating communism. But as for my question, I'd like to ask, the attitude of the 80s, the attitude of decadence and that type of feel-good and greed, how does that attitude translate into the 90s, and what kind of effect will it have on people in our generation as well as for the baby boomers?
Helen, you want to take that?
It's been by default. This question's been passed to me. I think that there is a desire on the part of people and a need to find supports and to become each other's supports and to reach out in that sense. Certainly, the thing that is talked about most when you travel around, when you talk to people and you try to talk to them about politics in focus groups or just in reporting, they start talking about their kids. The parents who are my age are talking about their kids who are your age who have moved back in. The parents who are younger are talking about their kids that they are worried about who are teenagers or worried about who don't have childcare. It depends, but people are talking about family. And so if you're talking about politics and the people you're talking to are talking about family, you start saying family is the major political issue these days, or also caring for their elderly parents. I mean, I hear this again and again and again. It's what people talk about, and it's also what people in your generation have come out of and are going to be establishing families yourselves within the 90s in all probability, even though that seems a very distant notion at the moment. And we haven't yet really figured out ways to, we haven't really reached out and in ways that will shore up American families. And I think I may have drifted off from your original question, in which case you can repeat it because the hour is getting late. But I think that's one of the issues that faces the baby boom generation in particular, and is going to face yours.
Thank you.
If I can also add to that, Charlie, just very quickly. You make a very articulate case for your point of view, and I understand where you're coming from, but if I can just state the other point of view, too, the point of view that Muklas stated a few minutes ago. If you look at polls, and polls aren't truth, okay, and they're not necessarily reality, but they do show how people feel. Young people do very strongly feel that Ronald Reagan was a good president. They agreed, not necessarily with a lot of the things that he did, but they agreed that he was a strong leader and that was very different in their lifetime, that they'd never seen anything like it, and they tended to be very, very pro-Reagan and very pro-Republican. And yeah, there definitely are a lot of people who disagree with what he did, and there are a lot of people like yourself, but there's a majority of people in your generation who feel the other way.
I'd like to say one thing just very quickly. There is now statistical evidence that there really is a shift among young people. When the freshmen entering college students each year are asked what they want to do for their career paths, there was a dramatic shift from public service, teaching, and all the rest way down into business and the rest in the 80s. Now that's beginning to turn, the last survey of that. It's interesting. Not much, but it's beginning. And I think there is clearly, you can sense, and from that you can draw that there is an opportunity to talk about larger questions. It hasn't yet reached the political process, but I think undoubtedly it's there.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask Haynes Johnson this question as to what, I haven't read his book, and I'm not sure it's covered, as to what he perceives the role of the press, both printed and electronic, had to do with some of the problems and difficulties that he sees has evolved from the 80s. I'm thinking specifically of the distortion of the electoral process, the Tefloning of the Reagan image to project Mr. Lacey's approach to Reagan, and so many of the other things, the SNL and so forth, that seem to have been neglected by our public press in terms of their responsibility to the politic and the public.
I spend a great deal of time talking about and trying to understand the electronic culture and its imprint on our lives, and not the least of that with all the things you're talking about, and through the political process and how it happened, and the shortening of the time span, and the 8-second the commercial hits, and the rest, and the fact how Reagan absolutely fit that perfectly for the country. As far as the press goes, I think we were sleepwalking too. I went back to my office a couple of years ago and had them call up on the computer to see when we started writing about such names as Michael Milken, Ivan Boesky, the Savings and Loan, or HUD, and it didn't happen on any of them until they became crisis. What we do, particularly through television, is we focus on the personalities of political figures. We always have, Len being a former reporter himself, but particularly in the age of television, and this is a bipartisan thing, all attention is focused more and more on the presidency. So when you turn on your evening news at night, you see the president dominates the equation. We don't report on the Congress very well at all, except we don't report on institutions very well. We don't report on how Wall Street really works. We don't report on education. The things that we're now talking about, we really didn't basically report on too well during the 80s, in my view. I don't mean that we didn't report on a lot of it, but essentially we didn't do the job as well.
No consistent reporting.
No consistent reporting, yes.
Thank you, sir.
My name is Robert Fraser. I'm a visitor here in Cambridge. I find that one of the major things that happened for me as a result of the 80s was a deep doubt in our Congress. And in part, that doubt I felt was reflected on the part of people in the nation who felt that there should be a restriction of terms, or there should be something to somehow affect the way our Congress performs. And I wonder if that's part of your book, Mr. Johnson, or if anybody else would like to comment on what's the future for our Congress.
I don't think the Congress functioned very well in the 80s. I don't think it's functioning very well now. I think that the Congress bears a heavy burden for the policies. They do have the power of the purse. They do have the power to declare war. They do have the power to authorize and form armies and navies, and I don't think they did a very good job in that. And I think that's part of the process we're in, and there are reasons for that. I think they have become far more broken down institutionally. The parties have declined. There's a lot of things we could talk about, and that's all part of it. And part of it's electronic, part of it's money. The fact of money, the individual, the role that money plays in every campaign. I think in your state, in California next year, there are going to be 2 United States senators elected. Someone told me when I was out there it's going to cost at least $40 million to elect 2 of them, and probably more.
Well, let's put it this way, Haynes. It's going to cost each candidate who gets through the primary and into the general, from the time he starts till the time of election day, whether he wins or loses, it's going to cost him roughly $20 million.
Yeah. I mean, and that's just, think about that. I mean, how do you do that?
Now remember this, though. California is a state of 30 million people. It's not Maryland, it's not Virginia, it's not Massachusetts. It's a huge state. It's a country unto itself. And sometimes I wish they would secede. But, so there's some reason for that. Another reason for this kind of expense, of course, is the cost of getting to the people. We talk about, well, you've got to get to the people so they understand. But you can't do it just by hoping some reporter will write a favorable story. And by the time you buy television and buy radio and do your campaigning, hire an airplane to go up and down, it's going to cost you money.
Let me, if I may, Charlie, speak to this too. Haynes, you're going to be shocked by this, but I agree with you on that point.
I am shocked with
in terms of
the evening was worthwhile.
No, in terms of divided government, I think that's one of the points I did agree with you on in the book. That is a real serious problem with our country, and that's the fact that you don't have a president who's getting support from his party, or alternatively, the people aren't electing a Democratic president who would have a majority in Congress, and that really is a fundamental problem. If you go back to the first half of this century, and you look at 1900 to 1952, there were 26 elections, 26 midterm and presidential elections. And 22 of those elections resulted in a unified government, meaning a president and a Congress of the same party. But since 1952 through 1990, we've had 20 elections, and 13 of those have resulted in a divided government. And that's a fundamental problem that we have in this country. And you know, it needs to be addressed, whether it's by term limitation or financial reform of campaigns or whatever. I don't necessarily agree that too much money is spent on campaigns.
Are you a campaign consultant?
Yes, but I don't.
Gotta move on. Ma'am, you have the last question.
Thank you. I haven't read your book, Haynes Johnson, but I've seen you and heard you on television. Have you explored what made the Boeskys, Ivan Boeskys, and the Millikins, and the SNLs, and who really made them possible, and the burgeoning real estate? Have you explored that at all? I have a good answer for you. But
Why don't we hear your answer? Let's hear your answer first.
I'm not.
Well, let's meet right after this forum is over. You can tell me before this.
Was the greed of the banking system and the insurance companies, because they made that possible. Because if you're in the real estate business, you don't own that property.
I do talk about Boesky and Milken and the whole climate a great deal. I can't say I solve the essential question of how it happened, but the climate was clearly there. The climate was I talked to many people on Wall Street, and I have some long interviews in there with the young people. It's fascinating about what it was like as they went through riding up the boom and riding up the M&A and mergers and acquisitions, and it was going to be the golden horn every moment, and tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And of course, and they knew what was happening too. Boesky going around with brown paper bags under the Brooklyn Bridge and passing out bribes and so forth. But they were caught up and swept up in the fever. In that, I think, it was like the 20s. And I think it was part of that. We really need a Gatsby story. Maybe that's the next book. I don't know.
I'd like to say, to the media. This is really, as a matter of fact, we have a media watch going on now. I think the best example was the Gulf Teflon War. This is appalling. And this is Bush's. The whole thing is coming out, and it's really very unnerving. It's pretty horrible. And I can't look to experts anymore. I think what we have to do is look at ourselves and have some moral questions. And
Thank you, ma'am.
I don't see any editorials in the media or anything like that. I suppose you'd all lose your jobs.
Well,
I wouldn't lose mine.
I wouldn't lose mine.
I'll only lose mine if we don't get out of here by 9:30. Can I just say that thank you all very much. To give Haynes a final word here, perhaps, in Kevin Phillips' analysis of the 80s, he comes out feeling positively, saying that history tells you that these decades of sometimes excessive behavior are followed by periods in which there was more of a neighborliness, there was more of a gentler, kinder attitude in the country. And I'm wondering if you see any signs, Haynes, or any of you, that this in fact is true, and that you look to the 90s and with some more optimism, perhaps, than we might have looked at the 80s.
Well, I'll tell you what I think, and Bill may be surprised, but my epilogue is very positive. I think we are headed into I believe in cycles of reform, and I believe we're going to have that. I believe it's inevitable. I believe it's going to have to happen. It will happen. I can't tell you when. I think it's the climate is there. The problems are such they're going to dictate it. A kind of leadership will emerge that will, because it comes from the bottom. The lesson of Eastern Europe and the lesson of Tiananmen Square and Gdansk and all these places is not that any one man created, or woman or person created those movements. It came spontaneously from below when the pressure arose to create it. And I think the same thing is going to happen here. I'm convinced of it. But don't tell me who it is going to lead it. It has to come from the things we're talking about here tonight to create a political pressure to change. And I think it will happen because it's happened recurring throughout our history. We go through these cycles, and I think we're in a new one now.
Thank you all very much.